Acadia is the first national park east of the Mississippi, and it's our only national park in the entirety of New England. It's the 5th smallest national park in our system at almost 50,000 acres. And that 50,000 is generous because it includes many private easements that expand the park. And to put it again in perspective, our closest national park here is the Congaree Swamp, which is just over half the size of Acadia. But you could fit 44 Acadias into Yellowstone National Park. And the bulk of those 50,000 acres, there. Okay, so there's Mount Desert Island, with over half the island comprised of Acadia National Park. But then there's 2 satellite units, one here to the north, Schoodic Peninsula, of about 2,400 acres, and then travel down the coast here to Isla Ho, and they're just under 3,000 acres, belong to the national park. So it's a bit scattered among this almost archipelago of islands. But yet, despite Acadia's small size, it's a top 10 national park. And I guess it's no surprise, this past year with the Centennial, it set an all-time record with over 3 million visitors. But because of its small size, it makes it sort of one of the highest people numbers per area of almost any national park. But Acadia's got a dizzying diversity of habitats, and I think the most conspicuous, spectacular feature are its mountains, which drop right down to the sea level. And within the park, there are some 26 peaks, 8 of which are over 1,000 feet. So surrounded by the sea, Acadia's got mile upon mile of this granite shoreline. And to give you a sense here, you're looking at Mount Desert Island, which is only about 14 by 18 miles in size, and yet has over 75 miles of shoreline. So it's this dramatic, convoluted shoreline. And much of that shore is subjected to big tides and powerful surf. And when those tides retreat, they reveal subtle and complex tide pools, a whole separate microcosm brimming with life. Large sections of the coast are rimmed by dramatic cliffs, some of them over 100 feet tall, cliffs of granite, such as these you see here on Schoodic Peninsula, Raven Cliffs. The island is dotted with ponds and lakes, mostly running north and south between these steep-walled mountain ridges. And these ponds and lakes provide critical freshwater habitats in very close proximity to the marine environment. Many beautiful marsh and meadow wetlands border the upwater, wetlands border these freshwater and upper tidal zones, and they're one of my favorite places to tromp around. Bogs scattered throughout the park host a myriad of carnivorous plants like sundew and pitcher plants, which we have right here in the Low Country.
We have sundew in the
Carnivorous, what do you mean?
Carnivorous, insect eating.
Oh.
And streams flow through most of the valleys in the park, offering these beautiful temporal waterfalls off the ledges, especially after heavy rains, which shed off the impervious granite surfaces. I mean, these islands are entirely comprised of granite with very little topsoil. Acadia has more than 125 miles of hiking trails, and countless with commanding views of the sea and the outer islands, such as you see here. And yes, this is a trail. This is the famed Jordan Cliffs Trail, right along a narrow ledge, and certainly not for the faint of heights. So how did this story of Acadia begin? Well, it started with a handful of key players, and among them was Charles Eliot, president of Harvard University. Eliot's son, again, was working for Frederick Olmsted, who is considered the father of landscape architecture and responsible for designing New York Central Park. But sadly, the son, who loved Mount Desert Island, died at the young age of 38 of meningitis. And so the father took on the preservation dream of Acadia in his son's honor. And the other principal, another, was George Dorr, who was originally just a summer cottager, going up there every summer because he loved it so. And Dorr became obsessed with the area, to the extent that for 25 years he put all his time and his fortune into land protection. Dorr ultimately died blind and poor, but he was instrumental in establishing the park. And it's really fair to say that Acadia would not exist today were it not for the efforts of George Dorr. Our third key player is a much more familiar name, John D. Rockefeller Jr. And Rockefeller loved the tranquility and the beauty of Mount Desert, and he gave millions of dollars in support of George Dorr's effort. In addition, Rockefeller gave land, about 10,000 acres overall, and he built carriage roads and monumental stone bridges, such as you see here, throughout the park. So it was these three educated men who were true visionaries at a critical time, and they devoted all their efforts for the public benefit versus creating a self-serving private enclave, which they so easily could have done. And the result, and this is important, is that Acadia was the first park created entirely from donated land. Ken Olson, one of the authors in our book, states that publicly owned Acadia would not exist without privately won wealth. With the Centennial reflecting on the past reveals testimony, I think, to the remarkable impact of the individual on conservation. Wherein even today, in a different era, we can't ignore or forget what only a few can achieve for the environment. And we see it right here with the work of our local land trusts, including Spring Island. And they're really at the ground roots level of all these preservation efforts. But well before the park, as word spread about this singular place, among the first to arrive were some of the early painters, Frederick Church and Thomas Cole in 1844, and others from the Hudson River School. All went up there and were enthralled with the landscape. And this is at the time when the natural landscape was part of our nationalism, our country's identity, even its religion. So it was occurring, again, as I mentioned, during this same period of the great discoveries that were happening in the American West. And it just swept up the imagination of the country. And so we embraced the concept at the time that nature with a capital M embodied the sublime and fostered really a higher sense of morality. So as people in these cities became more and more aware of these artists' dramatic renderings, so too then the first wave of visitors began, and these early rusticators evolved into the summer cottages, who built homes there and started to come every single year. Initially, the island of Mount Desert was called Île des Monts Déserts, or the island of the barren mountains, because most of these peaks are completely open granite balls. In 1916, just over 100 years ago, it officially became Sur de Mont National Monument from only about 5,000 acres. And then the formal transition to a national park occurred in 1919, when it was named Lafayette National Park, for the Frenchmen who served closely with George Washington during the American Revolution. In In 1929, as the park expanded, yet again its name changed, this time to Acadia National Park, which was derived from the word l'Acadie, the French translation of a Native American word, which simply stood for the place. L'Acadie, the place of sacred meaning and power. To put it in perspective, Ken Olson says of Acadia in our book that it's a century old in law, but at least 420 million years old by the clock. The focal point of Acadia is certainly Cadillac Mountain. It's the highest point on the eastern seaboard between Newfoundland and Rio de Janeiro. So think about, picture that, pull back for your satellite view and imagine that extent of coast. And these are the highest mountains right down to the sea. Glaciers sculpted the granite into bare, open summits and ridges throughout the island. The journey to the top of Cadillac to see sunrise has become a mandatory pilgrimage for most visitors because that first light of dawn to strike the U.S. kisses its summit from October to March. I mentioned to you the carriage roads of John D. Rockefeller. There are about 45 miles of them coursing through the park with beautiful crushed gravel surfaces and these stone bridges over almost every stream. And it's really one of the most unique features of the park. No other park has a system like this. And lakes and ponds abound throughout Acadia and Mount Desert. And some 26 of them, all glacially scoured out, with a few, such as Jordan Pond here, that are as deep as 150 feet. There are over 40 named streams, all very rain dependent, either flowing into these lakes and ponds, or some of them, as you see here, directly into the ocean, Man o' War Brook, that spills into the fjord of Somme Sound. MDI and Acadia are a major birding destination with over 330 species counted. Here, merlins perch on the shore of Eagle Lake. An American redstart takes flight. A northern Parula warbler. 23 species of warblers have been counted at peak migration in the spring and fall. A male yellow-rumped warbler. These guys are a challenge for me. They're tough. I'm not a good small bird photographer. It's running around in thick brush with too heavy equipment, but occasionally I get lucky. Here, a ruby-throated hummingbird feeds in a spring meadow of rhodora blossoms. And I bushwhacked at great effort to get out to this meadow, seeing it from a mountaintop, because the whole meadow was pink and magenta with the blossoms. And then when I got there, I just heard all this buzzing, and I've never seen so many hummingbirds in my life. They were everywhere. They were just thick.
Wow, that's interesting.
A great blue heron takes flight along the shore of Little Long Pond. An Atlantic puffin seen off the coast of Acadia. And some of these great nesting colonies, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, like Machias seal, are just a little bit up the coast. Even ubiquitous herring gulls, to me, provide an interesting subject along the shore. Chris Camuto, one of the authors in our book, writes that Mount Desert Island is a granite book of hours, a place to enjoy the nature of nature and to meditate on the great evolving fact of nature. When we were kayaking this afternoon, we saw a loon, but it didn't look like this because it was in winter plumage. But if I have a favorite bird of Acadia, this is it, the common loon. And its main signature bird for a good reason, because they're on many of the lakes and ponds, especially throughout Acadia. So So most of my images are taken from a kayak early in the morning when the waters are calm, and the loons are usually feeding, and then they'll dive for around a minute, but they can stay underwater up to 10 minutes. So my usual approach is to simply be conspicuous, but at a distance. And gradually I'll paddle or drift closer and closer while they pursue their normal behavior. And I simply let them get used to me, and it usually works. But the loons will typically dive and feed in a certain orientation. So when they're underwater, I paddle like crazy, just trying to guess where they're going to pop up. And if you're old enough as I am, you remember the old cartoons of Elmer Fudd and Bugs Bunny, and it's just that wily rabbit, in this case, where's that wily loon? And I get lucky, as you see here. Sometimes they pop up right next to me, and there we both are. But it's all about reading their behavior patterns, because they do transition through sequences. You know, they're hungry, they'll begin diving and feeding, and then they'll come up and loaf and preen for a while, and then they'll wing stretch and repeat the cycle. But their vocalizations are just beautiful. It's one of the most unique, haunting calls, and really a primal part of the Acadia soundscape. Quite laughably, though, loon calls have become the Hollywood cliche of bird calls, and often in places that are totally loonless. And, anyway, but the best for me is lying in bed at night with the window open, and a loon will fly over calling in the darkness, and it's just magic. This is one of my favorite photos, really just for its simplicity. A loon preening, truly elegant and graceful. They nest on floating vegetation, which, as you can imagine, is so vulnerable to water levels. You know, if rains occur like you've had recently here on spring, these nests get drowned out. But this was taken just this summer, and it was a goal I struggled for to photograph for the book, Loon on the Nest. And don't you know it, right after deadline, I get my loon on the nest. But it didn't diminish the experience any, I'll tell you that. And I went back 2 days later, and the nest was empty. And I looked around, it was a foggy morning, and thick light, and there they were. And the young ride, and this was also a shot I wanted in the book, too little, too late, but the young ride on the adult's back for only about a week, and then they get too big and the parent kicks them off. So the timing was good. But the parents are very protective. They keep the young close by, under constant surveillance. But the adults are also extremely territorial, and the males will battle with each other, especially during territories and nesting, really to the extent that these battles usually result in the death of one of the males about a third of the time. Shifting gears here from birds to fish. Every spring, a dramatic migration occurs as alewives come from the sea to spawn in the fresh waters. This was once Maine's most abundant migratory fish and is related to herring. But in recent history, the numbers have plummeted due to dams, overfishing, and pollution. But they used to journey up streams up and down the entire coast of Maine, and were so plentiful that they were a major source of bait for the fishermen in their lobster traps. But they still come in lesser numbers, and everything eats alewives. So with them comes this wonderful congregation of predators. And the ospreys hover over the shallow stream mouths, just waiting for a chance to dive. And once they get a visual and a laser lock, the wings begin to tuck, and the bird begins to drop in altitude, and then finally turns into a precipitous dive and a almost vertical plummet. They hit the water feet first, and you've seen this right here off the island, I'm sure. and with those incredibly long curved talons. And this was a near miss, unfortunately, but a great photo opportunity. And this same bird, about 2 or 3 attempts later, did score, which you see here. And success varies greatly individually. Some are just a lot more talented than others at it. But once that fish is in its talons, that osprey is handicapped, because that is a cumbersome load to fly with. And so suddenly you have this pecking order reversal here where the herring gull is harassing it, hoping the osprey will drop the fish. Yeah, I think this double-crested cormorant grabbed a little more than he could swallow, but all the more power to him. And while all this is going on, the harbor seals are launching sneak attacks underwater, these submarine attacks into the shallows, and feeding on the alewives. And I looked up, and this innocent bystander wandered out, wondering what all the action was about. And don't forget the eagles, our lazy boys, because they were always there, though less seen, because they would keep such a distance with their eagle eye. But they were waiting for their chance to get in the game. And but they are really lazy and tend to not generally make the catch themselves, but just let the ospreys do all the work. And again, you might have seen that right here off the island, because it's a fairly common event. And then as soon as the osprey would score, the eagle would launch in hot pursuit. But here again is that role reversal, where these smaller, more maneuverable birds will, any chance for them to pick on the alpha predator and outmaneuver him. So this great theater of alewives, I think, represents one of the defining elements of Acadia, because it symbolizes the interconnections of land and sea and humans as it plays out in this constant drama of predator and prey. And speaking of land and sea and humans, this was another opportunity I had this summer, and again, one that slipped away during the course of photographing for the book. I'd made a number of trips out to sea to find the humpback whales, and never really got anything. And this summer, for some reason, they were not only there, but put on quite a show. And not exceptional photographs, but to me what's important here is not just the obvious, but that's Acadia in the background. I really wanted to get that juxtaposition of these humpback whales feeding right off the shore of Acadia. And hopefully they'll keep coming back, but climate change is the ocean temperatures, some fishermen told me, were as much as 5 degrees above normal this summer. And for water, that's huge, huge. The shearwater and the seabirds are always active around wherever the whales are. And this was kind of fun. 3 humpbacks all at once surfaced. Again, with Acadia in the background. Not everyone wants their photo taken. I can't blame it. Good, you reacted perfectly. No, you did. Because you can't look at this without just going, oh, it's so cute, adorable, cuddly. And really that's because we can't help but assign our emotions to the subject. And yet, in nature, anthropomorphism gets a bad rap. And in the whole world of natural history, because it's not considered scientific enough. And we shouldn't let our emotions get in the way. You know, and obviously I'm a photographer for the aesthetics and the emotion, but so I would argue to the contrary. I really think that projecting our emotions onto wildlife plays a critical role in our feeling connected with the natural world, and arguably even sharing a consciousness on some levels where our feelings and awareness certainly must overlap. Here you're seeing swallowtail butterflies feeding on fresh otter scat. I'd been kayaking for several hours and stopped on an island to stretch. And as soon as I pulled up, I saw this wet, slick trail through the grass and a fresh deposit. And within minutes, these butterflies were all over it. And I spent the next hour plus on my stomach, 6 inches from otter scat. Who'd have thought it'd be so beautiful? And this day I was out hiking the rugged shoreline, taking landscapes, and suddenly this mink wandered out from between the rocks. Totally unexpected. But you know, I love these spontaneous moments. I mean, the surprises. And but I have to stay ready and alert, because they don't happen often, and you never know what's around the corner. And the same here, such as when this big buck suddenly emerged from the forest early in the morning. A peregrine falcon, which for me is really the holy grail of birds in Acadia. And at one point they had entirely disappeared from the park. But there's been a successful reintroduction campaign to the extent that on the average year now, there are 2 to 3 nests. 6 young were raised this summer. And it's a superb example of the rewilding of Acadia, and that a bird that was once gone is now brought back by humans and our own endeavors. So we can occasionally turn things around. I'm fascinated with tide pools. I love their myriad of life forms, their abstract patterns. For me, they're almost exotic and otherworldly in appearance. Here, mussels and barnacles on algae, all photographed through shallow water. Dog whelks and barnacles exposed at low tide. So with 10-foot daily tides, which is similar to the extremes that we have here, you know, but life on that rocky granite shore is adapted to these harsh extremes of inundation and exposure. The granite shoreline itself becomes a palette of color and pattern with abstract reflections, all taken from kayak. On close inspection, the rocks and the granite are often infused with minerals that leach out in these intricate patterns. And some of these render beautiful colors in abstract designs, especially when they're high in iron content. Surface lichens adorn pink granite. Here, lichen on granite again in an almost cosmic explosion. For the fishermen here, a sea-run brook trout displaying its own cosmic pattern. Catch and release, I want you to know. Or, actually, it was catch and drug. I was with biologists, they were electrofishing and drugging them, and then releasing them back. Night shots present a whole new opportunity with digital photography, and maybe some of you have pursued this. But we can capture the night sky as never before seen. Here you're looking up at the Milky Way. It's a difficult challenge technically, and frankly I'm not that great at it, but I'm getting better. And here's a star trail time lapse of about 1 hour over Jordan Pond. But what you're seeing is the light pollution of Bar Harbor in the background that gives it this kind of glow. Oh, let's see. Here. Let's see if this works. I wanted to give you a sense of the stars in motion and the clouds at night. This is probably my most successful time lapse on a crystal clear night. And you're seeing the stars rotating around the North Star. in about a 4-hour exposure. But what's incredible is the number of stars. This would never be visible in a single view. But yet they registered over the 4 hours. One night I tried here to photograph a meteor shower, and I kept the camera going most of the night, and finally fell asleep on the shore of the pond. And suddenly there was this incredible pow right next to me, and at first I thought a gun had gone off. It scared me to death. And I shined my light around, and there he was, my night stalker. A beaver had swum right up to me, and given me a piece of his mind. But I think he was as surprised to see me as I him, and warned me with a slap of his tail. But here one swims in molten waters of the early morning. I'd stopped at a pond in winter really to photograph the reflections in the openings in the ice. And again, that one of those serendipitous moments where a beaver popped out and began grooming. Acadia averages a little over 5 feet of snow a winter, and that's sort of a typical winter, but it's all over the map now, very sporadic. But that's because of the tempering effect of the sea, so that often the snow just doesn't last, doesn't hold. But I love winter because the park is almost empty. Most of the roads are closed down, and there's this wonderful atmosphere of just solitude and quiet. And the cross-country skiers come from all over, especially when there's decent snow, because of those carriage roads. And those carriage roads are groomed just for the skiers. But, I've worked from skis, snowshoes, crampons, the whole deal, but it's terribly difficult to get around if the snow has any depth at all, especially with all my gear. But winter serves as a brief reminder for us that once this entire area was covered by glaciers, some of them over a kilometer thick. And sometimes the only sound to break the silence in winter is the cracking and groaning of the ice on the lakes and ponds. Here, Jordan Pond that you see is partially frozen, but not quite enough to support the ice fishermen who drag their huts out on skids until the spring thaw. And I've often wondered how many huts might be at the bottom of the lake, because sometime that thaw gets ahead of them, and there've got to be a few that didn't make it off the ice. Clearly, they get into assigning a lot of character to their ice hut. With photography, there's always the one image that eludes you, and one winter I'd heard that there were several snowy owls hanging out on the mountaintops. But there'd been a massive snowfall, and I just couldn't get up there. I couldn't make the climb. And so this shot, my first sighting in my life of a snowy owl, was taken at the Bar Harbor Airport next to the runway. And I'm using everything. The quality's terrible. It's over 1,000 millimeters away. But the owl just sat there with jets taking off. And it would look up as each jet took off, and then just never budged. But it's probably no surprise that my favorite season of all is the autumn, with its vibrant hues and its dynamic weather. The old saying that if you don't like the weather, wait 10 minutes. But that's so true, because it's constantly changing. And especially with that interaction of the mountains and the sea. But the mountains create these beautiful reflections in all the ponds. And the peak and intensity of colors differs each year in kind of this hit or miss dance of timing. But fortunately, I went up enough that I kind of covered the whole spectrum. And the cliffs take on their own patterns of color, kind of like a great wall canvas. Here you see the famed precipice cliff on Champlain Mountain. But the visitor profile also changes in the fall because it's mostly older folks. The kids are in school, and these visitors are more interactive with the landscape and in a way more appreciative. They're hiking, they're biking, they're horseback riding. But autumn is no surprise is also when most of the photographers show up. And literally without fail, I run into half a dozen photographers with no planning at all, who are friends and colleagues, to the point where it's kind of become a homecoming, where we share the inspiration and the energy. But the subtle details of autumn are so vibrant, like these pitcher plants deep in a bog, or simply the changing patterns of wind-blown pine needles and leaves on water. Standing there long enough, there's bound to be a composition. Even though it looks more like my stomach after too much lobster, maybe. But Acadia, like most national parks, is not without its problems. I mean, it's suffered a decade of underfunding. Tourism has brought traffic and human congestion to many parts of the park, and that's throughout much of the year other than winter. And to give you a sense of it, this summer alone, Cadillac Mountain, they had to close 8 times because of gridlock, absolute gridlock. 3 times just on July 4th weekend by itself. But this is a scene where I found myself at a classic sunset view one evening. And it certainly raises the question, how many photographers does it take to photograph a sunset? But I got the shot that ended up in the book. So. But Mount Desert is assaulted by cruise ships. And, boy, does that sound familiar to some of us in Charleston right now. And these mansions go up on pieces of land surrounding the park. And up there, cruise ship visitation has increased 300% in the last decade. And I've been there, particularly in the fall, there'll be 3 major cruise ships in port at once. And I hope we don't come to that in Charleston. But a lot of these prevailing problems are really urban issues. They're issues of traffic, drugs, misbehavior. And yet, if you compressed Earth's history into 24 hours, we've only been around for about 25 seconds. And yet, look at the impact we've unleashed on our natural habitats. So the paradox of our national parks is that we've preserved this hallowed ground, but to use the cliche, we're loving them to death. And Dayton Duncan, one of our authors, wrote exactly that in an editorial to the New York Times recently. So if it were not for groups like Friends of Acadia, with whom I affiliated, who raises major funds in support of the park and conducts all these numerous park projects, Acadia and many of the other national parks which have their own friends groups just wouldn't exist. They wouldn't be viable without these support groups. So to give you a simple perspective on it, Acadia gets less than half its budget from the federal government. Less than half. So the private sector has to fill the gap. Since the geographic timeline is beyond comprehension, we instead tend to embrace the human timeline. And in this respect, I realize I've been knocking around Acadia for over half its lifespan to date. In a way, it makes me feel old. But I'll tell you, it also keeps me young, it keeps me going, and I'll keep going back. My intent is not to reflect on the past, but to deal with the here and now and the motivating power of the moment and of the experience itself. I've had this wonderful privilege of working with an exceptional team that produced this book, from the writers to Rizzoli Publishers, Friends of Acadia, in partnership with our sponsors. And so I feel lucky indeed, because every photographer I know would give their eye teeth to have such a project. But it did come about as the culmination of years of exploring Acadia and pursuing those special moments and places to the extent that I almost knew intuitively when and where to be. My visual objective was to create a sense of place, to capture Acadia's timeless, spontaneous, and sacred moments. To evoke a feeling of deep time as dictated by its primal rhythms of weather, tides, and seasons. Photography is a dialogue. It's really a negotiation with the natural world, and I approach it with the mindset of a hunter-gatherer. And sometimes those quests are intensely target-specific. Engaging my body in the landscape heightens the senses in the mind's eye, much of it revealed through sweat and physical contact with the rugged terrain. You have to dive in, there are no shortcuts. And such that the very simple doing of hiking or paddling becomes the reward, the enlightenment, even above and beyond using a camera. Our mission in nature should be to engage with all capacities to forge a connection between oneself and the landscape. In that sense, I think it's more important to notice than to know, wherein curiosity is more important than knowledge itself. The skill is in simply noticing. Nature just is. It doesn't demand a faith or an orthodoxy. Chris Camuto writes in our book, "We turn to the classic landscape to be in the presence of the great forces of nature, out of which our own nature, especially our curiosity and consciousness, evolved." He continues, "We are reminded at every turn that art comes from nature. Nothing is more sustainable than an aesthetic response to nature. Slow down, observe, appreciate, protect." My photographic goal is to render the common as uncommon. To express the joy that somehow nature is still working in all its complexity. And to convey in the broadest spectrum nature both as vulnerable and delicate. And also monumental and powerful, as you see here when Hurricane Bill ravaged the coast of Acadia. The Acadia of today may be far from a true wilderness, but to the extent that consciousness is simply being aware, Acadia offers us the opportunity to feel wild and be conscious at a higher level. Dayton Duncan writes in our book, "Every national park represents a pact between generations, a gift outright from one generation to the next, gift and obligation." The geography of philanthropy, Ken Olson calls it. The geography of philanthropy without which the park would not exist, because philanthropy itself assigns a higher value. We borrow from the present, but we give for the future. For well over a century, people have gathered at Acadia in celebration of place. They keep coming back year after year, generation after generation, seeking those shared experiences. My wife, Lynn's family, is one of those. Going back to 1900, these women, 3 generations strong here, and we in-law tag-alongs, join forces every single year. And I have no doubt that my daughter Sarah will carry on the tradition. Our days revolve around interacting with the land and the sea. That's why we're there. And yet I recognize that this is a huge privilege. But as I hike, paddle, and photograph, I run into many folks from the campgrounds, the inns, the bed and breakfasts, and they too have been coming for years. On this centennial of our national park system, the very cover of National Geographic stated, "A park protected once is not protected forever." We simply tend to take them for granted. Acadia's status as a top 10 national park may justify its existence as a public land, but it doesn't necessarily secure its integrity as viable natural habitat. Acadia exemplifies nature as a destination, but nature's all around us, yet somehow we've grown disconnected. Our national parks have become symbolic islands that we seek in a sea of development and civilization. I think we need to adopt an island mentality, an island state of mind, which you have right here on Spring, wherein its very finiteness fosters a more nurturing commitment, wherein we perceive it as a fragile terrestrial ark. Simply put, we need wildness to realize there's something wild within us. The very act of engaging with the landscape makes us feel connected, which makes us feel caring. Oop, lost my spot here, sorry. Such that wherever we are becomes the place, as the Abenaki Indians called Acadia. I'd like to close by reading to you a passage I wrote in our book. When I'm enveloped in Acadia, when the sun is just rising over tide pools and not another soul is around, yes, I own that moment. Yet, it's the accumulation of these experiences that matters more, because that sense of ownership then transcends to a sense of belonging. And to the discovery that we as individuals are inseparable from place and fully bound to it. The enlightenment of person by place is the baptism of Acadia. My goal is not just to reveal Acadia, but to affirm a sensuous shared vision, a connection to Acadia that stirs us to discover our own wildness there. And that wildness, in turn, will empower us to demonstrate that we are somehow worthy of our landscape. Thank you for joining me tonight, and here's a little background of what the project involved and who was there to see us through to the end.
Drama.